December 1977. Lockheed Experimental Facility, California. Engineer Dennis Overholzer sits before a primitive computer, staring at calculations the machine has been processing for the past 8 hours. The numbers make no sense. According to every law of aerodynamics, an object with this geometry should not fly. Sharp edges, flat surfaces, complete absence of streamlining. It contradicts 60 years of aviation science. But the mathematics of radar reflection are merciless and unambiguous. This ugly, angular object will be virtually invisible to any radar system. On the same day, 8,000 kilometers away in Kupovna near Moscow, Soviet designers complete testing of the new S-300 surface-to-air missile system. The system can simultaneously track 100 targets and engage 12. The cost of a single battery equals 17 million rubles, the annual budget of an average Soviet city. Thousands of previous generation complexes already stand on combat duty. The Soviet Union has built the densest and most expensive air defense network in human history. What Soviet generals did not know was that the formulas on that California computer screen had already rendered their trillion-ruble investment meaningless. The Cold War would be won not by the quantity of missiles, but by a few lines of code and an understanding of physics that would prove inaccessible to a centralized system. The F-117 Nighthawk represents perhaps the most perfect embodiment of American Cold War strategy. Asymmetric innovation that bypassed Soviet strengths entirely. While the USSR poured resources into building the world's most formidable air defense network, a layered system of radars, missiles, and interceptors designed to create an impenetrable shield over Soviet territory, the United States invested in fundamental physics and computer science to make that entire infrastructure irrelevant. This was not merely technological one-upmanship. It was economic warfare disguised as engineering. Every ruble the Soviets spent on air defense became wasted capital the moment stealth technology matured. The mathematics were brutal. The USSR had built a Maginot Line in the sky, and America had found a way to walk through it unseen. The genius of the stealth approach lay in its efficiency. A single F-117, costing approximately $42 million, could penetrate defenses that had required tens of billions to construct. This was not just about military capability. It was about bankrupting an opponent through technological sophistication they could neither match nor counter. To understand the magnitude of the F-117's impact, one must first comprehend what the Soviets had built. Beginning in the 1950s, the USSR embarked on the most ambitious air defense program ever conceived. The system evolved through multiple generations. The S-25 ring around Moscow, comprising thousands of missiles. The mobile S-75 that shot down Gary Powers' U-2 in 1960. The S-125 low-altitude systems. And finally, the computerized S-200 and S-300 complexes that represented the pinnacle of Soviet military technology. By 1980, the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies operated over 10,000 surface-to-air missile launchers. The production facilities for these systems employed hundreds of thousands of workers. Research institutes dedicated to radar technology consumed a substantial portion of Soviet military R&D budgets. The PVO Strany, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, was not merely a branch of the military, but an entirely separate service, equal in status to the Army or Navy, with 500,000 personnel. This was defense as national obsession. Soviet military doctrine, shaped by memories of devastating German air raids during World War II, treated air defense as existential necessity. If the Americans could not penetrate Soviet airspace, nuclear bombers could not reach their targets. Air supremacy became the cornerstone of deterrence. The system worked. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, American intelligence assessments consistently rated Soviet air defenses as formidable, perhaps insurmountable without accepting catastrophic losses. NATO war plans assumed that any conventional air campaign against Warsaw Pact forces would suffer attrition rates of 30% or higher. The fortress seemed impregnable. But fortress logic contains an inherent vulnerability. The more resources invested in static defense, the more catastrophic the consequences when that defense is circumvented. The Soviets were building walls while the Americans were learning to walk through them. The theoretical foundations of stealth technology emerged not from military laboratories, but from an unlikely source, a Soviet physicist. In 1962, Pyotr Ufimtsev published a paper titled Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction. His work, considered too theoretical and impractical by Soviet military authorities, was translated and published in the West. American engineers at Lockheed's fabled Skunk works recognized what Soviet bureaucrats had missed: a mathematical framework for predicting and minimizing radar reflection. Dennis Overholzer, a specialist in radar cross-section analysis, seized upon Ufimtsev's equations. Working with limited computer resources by modern standards, Overholzer developed a program called Echo-1 that could calculate radar returns from complex geometric shapes. The revelation was stunning. An aircraft composed entirely of flat panels arranged at precise angles could scatter radar energy away from the source, rendering the plane nearly invisible despite being physically large. This insight contradicted decades of aviation orthodoxy. Aircraft designers had always prioritized aerodynamic efficiency, smooth curves, streamlined profiles. Overholzer's calculations suggested that aerodynamic performance could be sacrificed for radar invisibility, and the trade-off would be worthwhile. For a penetration bomber operating at night against heavily defended targets, being invisible mattered more than being graceful. The program that would become the F-117 began under conditions of secrecy so extreme that even its existence was classified. Lockheed's proposal, codenamed Have Blue, called for a subsonic aircraft with a radar cross-section smaller than a bird. In 1977, two Have Blue prototypes began flight testing at the remote Groom Lake facility in Nevada, the base known publicly as Area 51. The test pilots hated it. The aircraft, with its faceted surfaces and fly-by-wire controls, handled like nothing they had experienced. It was aerodynamically unstable, requiring constant computer correction to remain airborne. Maximum speed was subsonic. Range was limited. By conventional metrics, Have Blue was an inferior aircraft. But when engineers measured its radar signature, the results exceeded projections. The aircraft was effectively invisible to radar systems designed to detect conventional aircraft. The trade-offs, poor handling, limited performance, became acceptable costs for achieving what Soviet designers had deemed impossible. In 1978, the Pentagon authorized full-scale production of what was designated the F-117 Nighthawk. Lockheed would build 59 aircraft at a facility in Burbank, with final assembly at the Tonopah Test Range in Nevada. The program remained classified. Officially, the F-117 did not exist. Every aspect of the aircraft's design prioritized low observability. The fuselage consisted of flat panels coated with radar-absorbent material. There were no curves, no rounded surfaces, only angles calculated to deflect radar energy. Engine intakes were covered with metal grates to shield the compressor blades from radar illumination. Exhaust was cooled and flattened to reduce infrared signature. Even the cockpit canopy was coated with a film containing microscopic metal particles to prevent radar penetration. The cost per aircraft was substantial, approximately $42 million in 1980s currency. But the Pentagon's calculation was strategic rather than tactical. Each F-117 could perform missions that would otherwise require dozens of conventional aircraft and entail severe losses. Against high-value targets in heavily defended areas, command bunkers, communications facilities, air defense nodes, the Nighthawk offered a capability that simply did not exist elsewhere in the American arsenal. By 1983, the first operational F-117 squadron achieved initial operating capability. Pilots trained exclusively at night, flying from Tonopah under cover of darkness. The aircraft's existence remained one of the military's most closely guarded secrets. Not until November 1988, more than 5 years after the first operational squadron formed, did the Air Force publicly acknowledge the program. This decade of secrecy served multiple purposes. It prevented Soviet intelligence from understanding the threat, buying time for the stealth fleet to reach operational strength. It also concealed the aircraft's limitations: subsonic speed, inability to carry external weapons, dependence on precise navigation, which Soviet analysts might have exploited. Soviet intelligence detected hints of American stealth research as early as the late 1970s. Satellite imagery showed unusual aircraft at Groom Lake. Fragments of information leaked through technical journals and defense contractor networks. By 1980, the KGB had compiled enough evidence to conclude that the United States was developing low observable aircraft. The Soviet response revealed the fundamental asymmetry between the two systems. Soviet radar designers began studying counter-stealth technologies, lower frequency radars that might detect stealth aircraft through longer wavelengths, bistatic radar systems using separated transmitters and receivers, infrared detection systems that could track engine heat rather than radar reflection. Some of these approaches showed theoretical promise. Lower frequency radars could indeed detect stealth aircraft, but only at dramatically reduced ranges and with insufficient precision for missile guidance. Bistatic systems worked in laboratory conditions, but proved impractical for battlefield deployment. Infrared detection offered some capability, but was severely limited by weather and range. More fundamentally, the Soviet system lacked the industrial and computational infrastructure to develop its own stealth aircraft. Creating a low observable design required sophisticated computer modeling, calculating radar cross-sections for complex geometries across multiple frequencies. Soviet computing technology lagged a generation behind American capabilities. The machines that could perform the necessary calculations either did not exist in the USSR or were too rare and valuable to dedicate to speculative aircraft design. Manufacturing presented equal challenges. Stealth aircraft required precision assembly, exotic materials, and quality control far beyond Soviet aerospace norms. Radar-absorbent coatings demanded chemical sophistication that Soviet industry could not reliably produce at scale. Even if Soviet designers could create a stealth prototype, mass production would be nearly impossible. The centralized Soviet system, optimized for producing large quantities of conventional weapons, proved incapable of the kind of innovation stealth technology represented. There was no Soviet equivalent to Lockheed's Skunk works. No organization empowered to pursue radical designs outside normal bureaucratic channels. Innovation required approval from multiple ministries, each with veto power, each answering to a Politburo that prioritized political reliability over technical excellence. By the mid-1980s, Soviet military analysts understood they faced a threat they could not counter. Internal reports acknowledged that American stealth aircraft would be able to penetrate Soviet air defenses with impunity. The decades of investment, the thousands of missile batteries, the elaborate radar networks, all would be rendered obsolete by physics and geometry. The F-117 remained untested in combat until January 17, 1991, when Operation Desert Storm began. Iraq possessed an air defense system built on Soviet principles and equipped with Soviet hardware. SA-2, SA-3, SA-6, SA-8 missiles, French-built radars, a dense network modeled directly on Warsaw Pact architecture. Baghdad was among the most heavily defended cities in the world, its air defenses comparable to those protecting Moscow. At 2:51 a.m. local time, the first bomb fell. A 2,000-pound GBU-27 laser-guided munition dropped by an F-117 onto the Iraqi Air Force headquarters. Over the next 43 days, F-117s flew 1,071 sorties, less than 2% of total coalition missions, yet struck more than 40% of strategic targets. The aircraft operated exactly as designed. Flying at night, navigating by precise GPS coordinates, F-117s penetrated Iraqi airspace without escort. Iraqi radar operators saw nothing. Surface-to-air missile batteries fired blindly into empty sky. The few attempts to visually acquire the aircraft failed. The Nighthawk's angular shape and dark coating made it nearly invisible against the night sky. The statistical results validated a decade of development. Not a single F-117 was shot down. Bombing accuracy rates exceeded 90%, far higher than conventional aircraft. Pilots reported that Iraqi air defenses, so formidable on intelligence assessments, were effectively non-existent. The fortress had been bypassed entirely. For Soviet military observers, Desert Storm provided devastating confirmation. The air defense doctrine they had spent 40 years perfecting had been rendered obsolete in 43 days. American aircraft had operated with impunity over heavily defended targets. The S-75 and S-125 missiles Iraq employed, proven systems that had shot down American aircraft over Vietnam, never acquired their targets. The true genius of the stealth revolution lay not in technology alone, but in economic asymmetry. Consider the mathematics. The Soviet Union had invested an estimated 200 billion rubles in air defense infrastructure by 1985. Radars, missiles, command systems, training facilities, personnel. This represented a substantial fraction of total Soviet military expenditure over 3 decades. The American investment in stealth technology was comparatively modest. The F-117 program cost approximately $6 billion from inception through production. Development of radar-absorbent materials and computational modeling required perhaps another $1 billion in research funding. For less than $8 billion, a tiny fraction of Soviet air defense spending, the United States had created a capability that negated Soviet investments worth hundreds of billions. This was economic warfare through technological leverage. Every dollar America spent on stealth forced the Soviets to spend far more on countermeasures that would prove inadequate. The asymmetry compounded over time. As stealth technology matured and production costs declined, Soviet countermeasures grew more expensive and more complex, consuming resources the declining Soviet economy could ill afford. The Reagan administration understood this dynamic perfectly. The Strategic Defense Initiative, derided as Star Wars by critics, served a similar purpose. It did not matter whether the technology could actually create an impermeable missile shield. What mattered was forcing the Soviets to spend billions responding to the threat. Stealth aircraft, space-based defense, precision-guided munitions, each program had the same effect. Draining Soviet resources while exploiting American technological and economic advantages. By 1985, Soviet military planners confronted an impossible dilemma. They could not match American technological innovation, could not develop equivalent stealth capabilities, and could not defend against aircraft they could not detect. The only solution would be fundamental economic reform, opening Soviet industry to the kind of free-flowing innovation that had produced stealth technology in the first place. But such reform would require dismantling the very system that kept the Communist Party in power. The choice was bankruptcy or revolution. In the end, the Soviet Union got both. November 1988. Tonopah Test Range, Nevada. Major General Albin Aikar, commanding general of U.S. Air Forces in Europe, stands before a radar screen at a temporary command post. He has been invited here for a demonstration, the details of which have been kept secret even from most high-ranking military officials. The operator activates the tracking system. The most powerful Soviet air defense complex, the S-200, captured by Western intelligence services and secretly transported to the United States for study. This monster can detect targets the size of a grapefruit at a distance of 200 kilometers. The system is calibrated. The sky is clear. The technician reports that the object departed 3 minutes ago. Aikar watches the screen. Empty. Absolute silence. The operator checks coordinates, retunes frequencies, increases radiation power. Nothing. 40 seconds later, a message comes through from the pilot reporting that he is passing over the command post at an altitude of 1,000 feet. Aikar rushes outside and manages to see a black triangular silhouette gliding silently over the range before dissolving into the desert twilight. The Soviet radar system, on which the USSR spent billions of rubles and years of labor by thousands of engineers, detected absolutely nothing. What General Aikar did not know at that moment was that he had just witnessed the final verdict on the Soviet air defense system. The most expensive and technologically sophisticated defensive network in human history, this black ghost, the F-117 Nighthawk, had turned it into a museum piece in a single night. Years later, after the Soviet Union's collapse, Russian military officers and defense analysts would acknowledge what had been obvious to careful observers during the 1980s. Marshal Sergei Akromayev, chief of the Soviet General Staff, wrote in his memoirs that by 1985, Soviet air defenses faced weapons they had no effective means of countering. The admission was careful, couched in technical language, but the conclusion was unmistakable. The decades-long Soviet investment in air defense had been strategically defeated. Viktor Belenko, the Soviet pilot who defected to Japan in 1976, later observed that Soviet military technology excelled at incremental improvement, but failed catastrophically at fundamental innovation. The system could build better missiles, more powerful radars, faster interceptors, but it could not conceive of making the target invisible. That required a kind of lateral thinking that centralized bureaucracies systematically suppressed. Pavel Grashev, who would become Russian defense minister, acknowledged in a 1993 interview that Desert Storm had shocked Soviet military planners more profoundly than any event since World War II. The Iraqi air defense system was built on Soviet doctrine, equipped with Soviet hardware, manned by Soviet-trained personnel. Its comprehensive defeat demonstrated that Soviet military theory had failed to anticipate the direction of modern warfare. Perhaps the most telling admission came from Alexander Yakovlev, a Politburo member during the final years of the Soviet Union. He wrote that the USSR's inability to compete with American technological innovation in the 1980s, not just stealth aircraft, but computers, precision weapons, communication systems, had convinced him that fundamental economic reform was the only path forward. The Soviet system could no longer afford the Cold War arms race. The choice was reform or collapse. The engineers who had built Soviet air defenses understood the implications most clearly. In technical journals published after 1991, Russian radar specialists described the theoretical challenge stealth technology presented. Their calculations confirmed what American tests had demonstrated. Low observable aircraft could not be reliably detected or tracked by conventional radar systems. Countermeasures existed in theory but proved impractical in deployment. The fortress could not be defended against an enemy who could not be seen. The F-117 Nighthawk flew its last operational mission in 2008 and was retired from service, rendered obsolete by newer stealth designs that corrected its limitations, while retaining its fundamental invisibility. But the aircraft's strategic legacy endured long after the last Nighthawk landed. The Cold War was not won on battlefields, but in laboratories, on factory floors, in the creative chaos of organizations like Lockheed's Skunk works. It was won by a system that could empower individual engineers to pursue radical ideas, that could transform theoretical physics into operational hardware, that could innovate faster than opponents could respond. The Soviet Union built fortresses, massive, expensive, technically sophisticated fortresses. The United States learned to walk through walls. This was not simply a difference in military strategy, but a fundamental distinction between systems. One optimized for control and standardization, the other for creativity and disruption. The mathematics were always unfavorable for Moscow. In any contest where innovation determined victory, where technological sophistication trumped numerical superiority, where economic efficiency mattered more than ideological purity, the centralized Soviet system was structurally incapable of competing. The F-117 merely made this asymmetry visible. An aircraft that embodied everything the Soviet system could not produce and could not counter. $42 million per aircraft. 200 billion rubles of air defense infrastructure rendered obsolete. This was not warfare as the 20th century had known it. Mass against mass, production against production. This was the future. Small numbers of sophisticated systems defeating large numbers of conventional forces. Innovation triumphing over investment. Knowledge overpowering resources. The black triangle that slipped through Soviet radar coverage in Nevada in 1988 did not merely demonstrate technological superiority. It revealed which system would inherit the future. In the end, the Cold War was decided not by who could build more weapons, but by who could build weapons the other side could not even imagine. The fortress fell not because it was stormed, but because someone had discovered how to become invisible. And in that invisibility lay the verdict of history.